It begins not with a sword, but with fear. The fear of losing, the fear of extinction. Long before kings and armies, before maps and borders, there were just people fighting for fire, for food, for tomorrow. The first wars weren't about glory. They were about survival. Imagine a world where every dawn could be your last, where the sound of a rustling leaf could mean an enemy tribe lurking in the shadows. That was the battlefield of our ancestors, raw, brutal, and unforgiving. Those early humans didn't have tactics, or training, or generals. They had instincts. They learned that the one who strikes first lives. The one who hesitates dies. But even in that chaos, a strange truth began to take shape. The strongest man didn't always win. The one who could unite others, who could make 10 people fight like one, was the real victor. The first lesson of war was born. Unity is strength. Picture a small tribe surrounded by enemies twice their size. The chief doesn't tell his people to fight for food. He tells them to fight for each other. That's when fear turns into fire. They defend every inch of ground, not as individuals but as one body, one heartbeat, and somehow, they win. That's where the story of winning wars truly begins. Not with weapons but with will. As centuries passed, those tribes became civilizations. The wars grew larger, and so did the stakes. Egypt rose from the desert, its pharaohs commanding armies like living gods. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was the bloodline of an empire. They built weapons of bronze, shields of leather, chariots pulled by horses that thundered across the sands. When Egypt fought, it wasn't chaos anymore, it was choreography. Every soldier knew his place, every move had meaning. That's how the second great lesson of war was written. Discipline is power. In ancient Greece, war became something else entirely. It became science. The Greeks studied their enemies, analyzed formations, calculated movements. They didn't just fight, they thought. The Spartans turned discipline into religion. From childhood they were molded into warriors who didn't know the meaning of fear. And when 300 of them stood against an army of thousands, they proved a truth that still echoes through time. Sometimes, courage and coordination can defy destiny itself. But courage alone doesn't win every war. The Persians learned that numbers aren't everything, and the Greeks discovered that genius could be a weapon. When Alexander the Great was only 20, he inherited a kingdom by 30. He had conquered half the known world, not because he had the biggest army but because he had the boldest mind. He studied the terrain before the battle, studied his enemies before the first arrow was shot. He attacked from where no one expected. He broke through lines no one thought possible. To him, war was a chessboard and he never made the same move twice. Every victory left behind a message carved in the dust. Wars are won long before the first sword is drawn. They're won in the mind, in planning, preparation, and the power to adapt. Alexander wasn't the only one who understood this. The Romans turned that idea into an empire. Their soldiers marched with precision, building roads and fortresses wherever they went, turning conquered land into their home before the enemy even knew they'd lost it. The Roman legions didn't just fight battles, they built systems. They had logistics, communication, structure. Each legionary knew his commander, each commander his orders. It wasn't chaos, it was an organized storm. And that's why the world trembled when Rome advanced. They didn't just conquer land, they conquered time. Their enemies had passion, but Rome had planning. Their enemies had courage, but Rome had control. The Romans proved a third great truth of war. Order outlasts chaos. But even Rome, for all its glory, eventually fell. Every empire does. Because war doesn't just test weapons, it tests the soul. When leaders forget why they fight, when armies lose purpose, no strategy can save them. The greatest weakness of any army is not its weapons, but its doubt. Now imagine a battlefield where iron meets flesh, where dust turns red under the feet of thousands. The sound of war, IS&T, just metal clashing, it's the heartbeat of men trying to outthink death itself. Every general knows this. Strength wins battles, but intelligence wins wars. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Greece, the formula of victory was always the same: unity, discipline, strategy, belief. And yet, every era added its own flavor. In the East, warriors were taught that the greatest victory was the one won without fighting. The Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." He believed that deception was more powerful than destruction. Make your enemy move when you want him to. Make him see what you want him to see. Control the field, control the fate. That philosophy changed everything. Wars stopped being about brute strength. They became games of illusion. Armies began to use misinformation, fake retreats, and traps. One general would burn his own supplies to make the enemy think he was weak, only to strike when the enemy least expected it. Another would light thousands of campfires to make a small army look vast. The battlefield became a theater, and the generals were the directors. The ancient world was full of such stories of underdogs who defied empires, of kings who lost everything because they underestimated the mind of their enemy. There was a rhythm to it all, the same rise, the same fall, the same truth. Victory always belongs to those who prepare, those who adapt, and those who refuse to break. But not every war was fought for power. Some were fought for survival. others for faith. There were soldiers who went into battle knowing they would die, but believing their death had meaning. In that belief, they found strength beyond human limits. Because sometimes, what decides a war isn't the size of the army, it's the size of the heart. Picture a lone warrior, standing before an army, his breath steady, his eyes cold, his hands shaking but his spirit unbroken. Behind him his people untrained, outnumbered, terrified, yet he doesn't tell them to fight for victory. He tells them to fight so their children won't have to. And that moment, that single spark of defiance, can turn ordinary men into legends. Wars have always been a mirror of humanity. They show what we fear, what we love, and what we're willing to sacrifice. From tribes to empires, from chaos to strategy, every age learned a new rule of war, but the core never changed. The secret of victory wasn't just in killing your enemy, it was in understanding him, outsmarting him, and sometimes forgiving him. Thousands of years later, we still ask the same question. How do you win a war? The answer hasn't changed. You win a war the moment you stop being afraid to lose it. You win when you learn faster, adapt sooner, and fight for something greater than yourself. The dawn of war taught humanity what it meant to survive. The rise of empires taught us how to organize. The age of thinkers like Sun Tzu taught us how to outsmart. Each generation passed down the same wisdom that no weapon, no technology, no number can replace the mind that wields it. And as night falls over the ruins of another forgotten battlefield, the lesson echoes through time. Wars may be fought with swords, guns, or words, but they are always won with the mind. The world changed. Steel replaced bronze, and faith replaced fear. Castles began to rise from the earth like mountains of stone. The smell of fire, sweat, and iron filled the air of every continent. This was no longer the age of survival or expansion. This was the age of domination, when kingdoms fought not only for land, but for belief, for pride, for heaven itself. The medieval world was built on loyalty and blood. Every sword carried a name. Every knight carried a vow. Kings ruled not just with armies but with symbols, crowns, crosses, banners fluttering in the cold wind. War had become more than killing. It was theater, it was politics, it was destiny. Picture this, a line of knights in armor so heavy it glitters under the sun like silver mirrors. Horses snort steam into the morning fog. The sound of drums and horns shakes the valley. Behind those men stand villagers, women, children, everything they loved. In front of them, the enemy waits silent, unflinching, thousands of eyes staring back. And then, the silence breaks. The ground trembles. The age of the sword has truly begun. But in this new era, war wasn't about chaos anymore, it was about control. Every battle was a game of patience. One wrong move, and an entire generation could vanish in a single afternoon. The smartest kings weren't the ones with the biggest armies. They were the ones who knew when not to fight. In the high walls of Europe, kings sat around tables made of oak, moving pieces on maps like chessboards. But beyond those castles, something darker was rising. A wave of faith so powerful it would ignite continents. The Crusades. Armies of men marching across deserts in the name of God, banners bearing crosses, swords blessed by priests. To them, war was no longer just about territory, it was about eternity. They believed they were chosen, destined to win. That belief made them unstoppable. When faith becomes a weapon, fear disappears. Men who believe they are fighting for heaven will walk through hell without blinking. The Crusades weren't just wars of steel, they were wars of spirit. But faith has two sides. It can unite, and it can destroy. As one side fought for salvation, the other fought for survival. Muslim warriors, led by legends like Salahuddin Ayyubi, proved that faith without mercy becomes tyranny, and that the true strength of a warrior lies not in cruelty, but in honor. Salahuddin retook Jerusalem not with hatred, but with grace. He gave his enemies safety instead of slaughter. And that single act made him immortal in history. Because sometimes, you don't win a war by how many you kill. You win by what you stand for after the killing is done. While Europe was fighting for faith, in the east, a storm unlike any other was gathering the Mongols. They came from the steppes, riding wild horses, faces hardened by cold winds and endless survival. They didn't have grand castles or polished armor. They had speed, discipline, and terror. When the Mongols attacked, they didn't just destroy armies, they destroyed the will to fight. Cities that resisted were wiped from existence. Cities that surrendered were spared. It was psychological warfare long before the term existed. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer, he studied fear. He made his enemies believe resistance was pointless. His armies could travel hundreds of miles in a day, disappearing into the horizon like ghosts, then returning when least expected. They used fake retreats, pretending to flee, only to encircle their pursuers and slaughter them. They communicated through flags, smoke, and drums. Their coordination so perfect that even modern generals still study their tactics. Their victory was not luck, it was systematic genius. Every man in the Mongol army knew his role. Their supply chains were faster than any empire before them. They carried messages across thousands of miles using horses that never stopped running. They learned the languages of conquered lands, used local maps, even turned captured enemies into allies. Genghis Khan's most powerful weapon wasn't his sword, it was his adaptability. He could change his tactics in the middle of a battle. When he faced heavily armored knights, he avoided close combat and struck from distance with arrows. When he fought city walls, he used engineers from captured lands to build siege weapons. His wars were laboratories of learning. That's the next great truth of war. Flexibility beats strength. The rigid break, the adaptable survive. But no matter how powerful an army becomes, time always tests its soul. The Mongols too eventually faced what every empire faces, the weight of their own success. The more they conquered, the harder it became to control. Victories breed pride, and pride blinds. The same tactics that once made them invincible began to fail. Enemies learned from them, adapted, evolved. That's another law of war. Every strength, if overused, becomes a weakness. In the medieval world, lessons came soaked in blood. Armies learned the cost of arrogance. Kings learned that alliances could break faster than swords, and soldiers learned that courage means nothing without wisdom. Yet, amidst the chaos, something new was awakening: technology. Gunpowder. At first, it was just smoke and noise, a curiosity from the East. But soon it changed everything. Cannons replaced catapults, muskets replaced bows. The old art of chivalry died on the battlefield, replaced by something far more mechanical, far more deadly. The knight in shining armor, the symbol of medieval honor, became obsolete overnight. The gunpowder age rewrote the rules of war. It was no longer about who had the bravest soldiers, but who had the best weapons. A peasant with a musket could kill a noble knight from 50 yards away. Power shifted from courage to innovation. The balance of war tilted forever. But even then, not everyone understood what truly won wars. Many kings still believed glory could be bought with numbers. They sent wave after wave of men into gunfire, believing quantity would defeat quality. They were wrong. The smarter generals realized that the future belonged to thinkers, not fighters. Look at the rise of the Ottoman Empire. They didn't just fight wars, they engineered them. When they took Constantinople, they didn't rely on courage alone. They brought massive cannons that shattered walls once thought unbreakable. They used math, architecture, and planning as their weapons. That siege marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. The Middle Ages were dying, and the modern era of war was being born. Still, through every change, one principle remained untouched: the power of leadership. 1,000 men without direction are 1,000 targets. But 10 men with a true leader are an army. History has shown this again and again. From the Crusades to the steppes, from the deserts to the mountains, wars are not won by weapons, they are won by will, guided by someone who knows how to use it. As the sun set on the medieval world, and gunpowder smoke filled the horizon, the lesson was clear. Victory belonged not to the biggest, the richest, or the most fearless. It belonged to the most prepared. Those who could think beyond the battle, who could see 5 moves ahead. Because in war, it's never just about who fights harder, it's about who learns faster. The medieval age left behind more than ruins and ashes. It left behind knowledge of what faith can do, what fear can destroy, and what strategy can build. The knights, the crusaders, the Mongols, the sultans, all of them were part of a single story. The story of how humanity kept redefining what it means to win. From the cries of dying warriors in dusty deserts to the sound of cannons echoing through stone walls, one truth stood above all: the weapons may change, but the human heart remains the same. The hunger to survive, the will to protect, the fire to rise again after every fall. That's what wins wars. And somewhere, in the ashes of a battlefield, a soldier looks up at the stars, his armor broken, his hands trembling, but his spirit whispering, "We fought, we learned. We will fight smarter next time," because the war never truly ends, it only evolves. They called it the Age of Chivalry, the time when knights in shining armor rode beneath banners of kings, and empires were built not only on strategy but on faith, courage, and iron will. Yet beneath that glittering surface of honor and heroism, this was an age defined by one truth. The world had learned to fight not for survival alone, but for power, for faith, and for destiny itself. The medieval world was a dangerous chessboard, stretching from the castles of Europe to the vast plains of Asia. And on this board, the players were ruthless. Kingdoms rose and fell overnight, and war became an art form, a deadly dance of steel and cunning. When the Crusades began, tens of thousands of men marched across continents, driven by something no army before had ever known: the fire of belief. They weren't just soldiers, they were pilgrims with swords. They believed that their war was sacred, that heaven itself stood behind their blades. For the first time in history, faith became a weapon, and belief became a force stronger than steel. But on the other side, their enemies had the same conviction. The Muslims defending Jerusalem weren't just protecting a city, they were defending their soul. Salahuddin Ayyubi, known to the West as Saladin, was no ordinary general. He was a master of patience, discipline, and mercy, a rare mix in an age of blood and vengeance. He didn't win battles through rage or cruelty. He won through strategy and respect. When he retook Jerusalem, he didn't slaughter his enemies, he spared them. That single act of mercy echoed louder than any sword could strike. And in that moment, the world learned that victory isn't always written in blood, sometimes it's written in restraint. Across the plains of Asia, another storm was rising, one that would shake the entire world. From the steppes of Mongolia came horsemen who moved like ghosts, faster than the wind, deadlier than any army before them. The Mongols, led by a man whose name would echo through centuries, Genghis Khan. He had no castles, no great cities, no golden crowns, but he had something the rest of the world had forgotten: simplicity and fearlessness. His army moved as one body, one heartbeat. They could cross hundreds of miles without rest, strike with precision, and disappear before the enemy even realized what happened. The Mongols invented a new way of war: speed, deception, and terror. They used fake retreats, ambushes, and psychological warfare centuries before those words even existed. When enemies thought the Mongols were fleeing, they were actually leading them into traps. Villages fell before they could even prepare defenses. It wasn't brute force that made Genghis unstoppable, it was intelligence. He turned chaos into control. But the genius of Genghis Khan wasn't just on the battlefield. He understood something most rulers didn't: that fear wins wars, but respect keeps empires. He built a network of loyalty and law that stretched across lands larger than any empire before. His warriors were loyal not because they were afraid to die, but because they believed in the system he created. It's easy to see the Mongols as monsters, destroyers of worlds, but beneath the ashes, there was method. They destroyed to rebuild, to unify, to command. They taught the world that mobility could crush might, and that adaptability was more powerful than any war. Meanwhile in Europe, knights rode into battle covered in shining armor, carrying swords that reflected sunlight like mirrors. They were symbols of bravery and nobility, but they were also bound by a rigid code, the code of chivalry, honor, loyalty, courage, ideals that turned warfare into ritual. Yet in the chaos of real battle, those ideals often shattered, because war doesn't care for rules. But from these contradictions came lessons that discipline without flexibility breaks, and courage without intelligence kills. The knights learned this the hard way. As crossbows and longbows began to dominate the fields, the era of heavy armor started to fade. Arrows pierced honor. Steel bowed before strategy. Then came a new kind of warrior, one who didn't wear shining armor or ride majestic horses: the common soldier. Armies began to grow not with nobles, but with farmers, peasants, and craftsmen. Kings realized that war wasn't just about the elite anymore. It was about numbers, training, and unity. The 100 Years' War between England and France changed everything. On one side stood the English longbowmen, ordinary men with extraordinary weapons. With their longbows they could strike from distances no knight could reach. At Agincourt they faced overwhelming odds, yet their precision turned the tide. Thousands of armored knights fell before arrows loosed by men who weren't even nobles. The message was clear: technology and discipline could defeat tradition. And in the midst of that war rose a young woman who became a legend: Joan of Arc, a teenage girl who claimed to hear the voice of God, leading armies into battle when women weren't even allowed near the front lines. Her courage inspired thousands. She fought not with strength, but with belief. And though she was captured and burned, her story outlived every general who mocked her. She became proof that wars aren't only fought with swords, sometimes they refought with conviction. Across seas and continents, other kingdoms learned their own lessons. In Japan, samurai perfected the art of war into philosophy. Bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that the greatest victory is mastering oneself. Samurai saw death not as defeat but as honor. They believed that fear was the real enemy, and discipline was the sharpest blade. In every culture, the same truth was being written again and again: that war reveals who we truly are. Whether it was a knight, a samurai, or a Mongol, the ones who won weren't always the strongest or the richest. They were the ones who could think, adapt, and believe. But as the medieval world expanded, so did its ambitions. Trade routes brought wealth and greed. Kingdoms began to dream of empires. Power shifted from faith to fortune, from swords to strategy. And soon, the world would enter an age where gunpowder would roar louder than thunder, and kings would learn that no wall, no armor, no code could stop the march of progress. The last great wars of the medieval era were fought not just for crowns, but for survival. The Ottoman Turks stormed Constantinople in 1453, ending the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire. Cannons shattered the once impregnable walls, proving that old defenses could not survive new ideas. It was the end of the old world and the birth of a terrifying new one. As the smoke cleared, the world stood on the edge of transformation. The age of swords was ending. The age of gunpowder, cannons, and empires had begun. But before the final chapter closed, one last truth echoed through the centuries: that no weapon, no army, no strategy could ever replace the power of belief. The belief that you are fighting for something greater than yourself. The belief that your cause, your people, your future are worth dying for. It's that belief that made knights charge into impossible odds, that made Mongol horsemen ride through deserts without fear, that made a young girl defy kings and armies. Because in every war, across every century, belief was the invisible weapon, the one that couldn't be broken, the one that couldn't be stolen. And when we look back across 1,000 years of battle from the deserts of Arabia to the castles of Europe, one truth remains: those who fight for something greater than power always leave a legacy greater than victory. The 20th century was not just another chapter in the story of human conflict. It was a transformation, a storm of steel and fire that changed forever how wars would be fought, and more importantly, how they would be won. The old ways of charging into battle with swords drawn were gone. Now, victory belonged to those who could command machines, manipulate information, and control minds. When the First World War began, nations marched with pride, still believing courage and numbers could carry the day. But they were wrong. The trenches of Europe turned that pride into mud and blood. Men realized that courage meant nothing when a single machine gun could cut down hundreds in seconds. Every inch of land was paid for in lives. Every step forward into no man's land was a gamble against death. Yet, amid this chaos, one truth began to emerge: the side that could adapt faster, that could learn faster, would survive. Technology was now the king of the battlefield. The invention of tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons redefined what it meant to fight. The war was no longer just about strength. It was about innovation, timing, and the ability to turn science into strategy. Soldiers who once fought face to face now feared invisible enemies, gas, artillery, and snipers hidden in the shadows. The old generals clung to old ideas, and those ideas buried millions. But the new leaders, the ones who dared to think differently, began to see the pattern. Wars were evolving into something far more complex than anyone had imagined. Then came the Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history. This was not just a war of armies. It was a war of ideologies, of willpower, of total commitment. Every factory, every scientist, every mind became part of the battlefield. The Blitzkrieg lightning war proved that speed and coordination could crush even the strongest defenses. Hitler's armies swept through Europe like a storm, their tanks and aircraft moving in perfect rhythm, overwhelming the slower, more traditional armies of the past. It was a brutal lesson. The first strike, when executed with precision and intelligence, could decide the outcome before the enemy even realized the war had begun. But the Allies learned. They studied the enemy, learned from every defeat, and turned those lessons into strategy. The Battle of Britain showed the power of information and communication, how radar, planning, and morale could stand against overwhelming force. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union proved the value of endurance and sacrifice, trading land for time, wearing down the German war machine until it broke. In the Pacific, the Americans mastered the art of logistics, building entire floating cities across oceans, turning industrial power into unstoppable momentum. By the end of the war, one truth stood tall. Wars were no longer won just on the battlefield. They were won in the factories, in laboratories, in intelligence offices, and in the hearts of those who refused to surrender. And then, in 1945, humanity saw what ultimate power looked like. 2 flashes of light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war, but they also began a new era. The atomic bomb changed the rules forever. For the first time, mankind had created a weapon so powerful that using it meant risking its own extinction. In the decades that followed, the Cold War began not with battles, but with silence, suspicion, and strategy. The United States and the Soviet Union stared at each other across the world, each holding the power to destroy the planet. It was a war fought with spies, satellites, propaganda, and fear. No bullets, no trenches, but make no mistake, it was war. Victory now depended not on who could kill more soldiers, but on who could control more minds. Espionage became an art. The CIA and the KGB waged invisible battles in every corner of the world. Agents traded secrets, governments played psychological games, and entire nations became pawns in a chess match for global dominance. It was during this time that the greatest lesson of modern warfare emerged. Knowledge is power, and secrecy is survival. Technology continued to evolve, and with it, the nature of war. The Vietnam War taught another painful truth: that victory is not always about firepower. The United States had overwhelming military strength, but the Vietnamese had something far stronger: patience, home-ground advantage, and an unbreakable will. They understood that wars of occupation are not won by conquering land, they are won by conquering hearts. Guerrilla warfare, ambush tactics, and psychological endurance turned a small nation into an immovable mountain. Every war after that carried new lessons. In the Middle East, armies learned the limits of technology when faced with the chaos of insurgency. In Afghanistan and Iraq, superpowers found that drones and missiles could destroy enemies, but they couldn't destroy ideology. Wars became endless not because of lack of strength, but because the battlefield had shifted from land to belief. Then came the digital age. Satellites, cyber attacks, artificial intelligence, and drones changed the meaning of war again. Now, battles can be fought without a single soldier setting foot on enemy soil. A hacker sitting thousands of miles away can paralyze a country's power grid. A drone can strike silently without warning. A social media campaign can start revolutions or crush them. The new generals don't carry swords, they carry data. And yet, even now, the lessons of the past whisper to us. Every great empire that believed itself invincible eventually fell. Every leader who ignored history found themselves repeating it. The tools have changed, but the psychology remains the same. Wars are still about survival, fear, pride, and the hunger for control. From the clash of swords to the hum of machines, victory still belongs to those who adapt, who learn faster, who see farther. But perhaps the most powerful lesson of all is this. Wars are not truly won on the battlefield, they are won in the moments before the first shot is fired. The greatest victories in history came from foresight, diplomacy, and understanding the enemy's mind. Sun Tzu's ancient wisdom remains as true today as it was 2,500 years ago. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. We have spent thousands of years perfecting the art of destruction. From spears and arrows to missiles and machines, humanity has evolved its ability to kill, but along the way, it has also evolved its understanding of peace. The greatest leaders learned that real victory isn't about annihilating the enemy. It's about ensuring the war never has to be fought again. As the 21st century unfolds, a new kind of war looms on the horizon. One fought not for land or religion, but for data, resources, and influence. Nations are no longer just building armies, they're building algorithms. Artificial intelligence now predicts battle outcomes, autonomous drones make life and death decisions, and cyber armies fight in the shadows. The battlefield has expanded to include every phone, every satellite, every server. In this world, the greatest generals are not those who shout orders, they are those who understand silence, code, and human psychology. And yet, despite all our progress, we still fight the same inner wars we always have, between greed and compassion, between fear and wisdom, between chaos and control. History shows us again and again that those who learn from the past rise, and those who ignore it fall. The Mongols, the Romans, the Nazis, the Soviets all believed they could not be defeated. All were wrong, because no matter how advanced our weapons become, war still begins and ends with the human mind. It's not the gun, the bomb, or the code that wins, it's the person behind it. The mind that can adapt, the will that can endure, the heart that refuses to break. And so, after 1,000 years of battle, after every empire, every general, every soldier, what have we learned? We've learned that to win a war, you must first understand it. You must know your enemy, know yourself, and know when to fight and when not to. Every great victory has come not from hate, but from clarity. From those who could see beyond the smoke and blood, who understood that real strength lies not in destruction, but in creation. And maybe that is the greatest lesson of all, that the ultimate victory is not in conquering others, but in conquering ourselves, because the wars outside us will never end until we win the war within us. So as you watch this, remember, history is not just a story of death and power. It's a mirror, showing us what we were, what we are, and what we could become. We can learn from the warriors who came before us. We can honor their courage by building a world where courage no longer means killing. If you've journeyed through these 1,000 years of battle with me, you already know the truth. Wars are not just fought with weapons, they're fought with wisdom. And if you've learned something here tonight, something that made you see the world differently, then don't let it end here. Because every like, every share, every subscriber helps this message reach one more person who needs to hear it. Together, we can make people remember history, not to repeat it, but to rise above it. So hit that subscribe button, join this journey, and let's keep uncovering the lessons that time tried to bury. Because in the end, knowledge is the greatest weapon and wisdom is the only way to win.